Okay, e-commerce students, today we're going to be talking about the ways that ethics, politics, and society intersect in our e-commerce world. We know, for example, that e-commerce has plenty of opportunities, but there are limits to that opportunity, be they economic, be they social, be they people who can't get credit and don't have ways to interact in the digital economy. And all of these things are impacted by our societal approaches and our legal approaches to these things. So this chapter is about technology, and it's about society, and it's about the way these things interact. What's our goal? Our goal is to explore the way that these concepts we've been talking about all throughout this class really kind of congeal in the way that we interact with technology, the internet, and e-commerce in general. There are lots of issues to discuss here, and although the technology is important, knowing the principles of e-commerce is important. It's important to understand how we interact with these types of systems and why. So we compare the United States to Europe and our approaches to things like privacy. For example, in Europe, in parts of Europe, people enjoy something called the right to be forgotten. There's an example. In Europe, for example, once you have served your crime, if you have been a person who was convicted of a crime, once you have served your time for the crime, that has to be legally expunged from Google search results because you've paid your debt to society. In other words, the idea being that once you've served your time, you're no longer viewed as a criminal. In the United States, Google does not face similar kinds of legislation. How does that impact us as individuals? Well, that means a crime that you have committed and potentially paid your sentence for could follow you around for the rest of your life on the internet. Because as we know, and the way things are set up right now, nothing really ever gets deleted on the internet. So should it be this way, or should we be following Europe's example? That's what we're going to be talking about in this chapter, those kinds of issues. So in terms of the internet has changed everything. As of time of recording, we're just now starting to understand, for example, what's going to happen with things like ChatGPT. Simply put, there are things that could not have been possible before the internet. There are things that technologically were not possible. The idea of carrying around a powerful mobile device that could report on us 24/7 was not possible. And so now these devices, these ways we're doing things, have been changed and enabled because of the internet, and they are changing and enabling us differently as well. What we have created is also creating us at this point in time. That's the framework for this chapter. So in terms of how we look at these issues, how we face these challenges, although they cross over, it can be helpful to kind of classify them in several categories. The categories of information rights, meaning what control over information do we have and people knowing things about us. Property rights, did we create something on the internet? Did we create intellectual property? Can it be duplicated? Who controls the rules? What's governance like? And also, where does one person's right begin and where does somebody else's end? What about the public welfare? How do we balance all of these capabilities with the needs for things like privacy and the well-being of individuals? So this is a big balancing act. So all this stuff fits together. The center of this hub, as we can see in the diagram, are these enabling technologies that we're talking about. And all of these things, the ethics are the inner core in the way they affect us as people. The societal issues, the social issues, the outside, how our interactions play with each other. Ultimately, then, the political issues are the outer core. The idea of how the laws come into place. And all of these are framed by what we just discussed. Information, property, rights, public safety and welfare, and governance. How do we control this stuff? So when we talk about ethics, I won't read this to you. It comes down to ethics is the idea of what we believe is right and wrong. And so it varies from one society to the next, but we have some things that we sort of hold as universal. Most people think that stealing is wrong, except a lot of the people who think stealing is wrong had no problem downloading free music back in the early 2000s. We think, for example, that telling lies is wrong, but we do it all the time on social media. That's how these kinds of technologies are changing the game for us. Responsibility means you have to take responsibility for your own actions. Ultimately, you may be accountable for things that you didn't do, though, because people who work for you are responsible for them. With liability, that's the idea of determining who ultimately is going to be held responsible, who's going to have to pay up. And due process simply means we have rules and procedures for going through this kind of process. And they get fuzzy when a lot of the things we're talking about don't happen in real life. They happen on the internet, and a lot of the products we're talking about don't physically exist. How do we look at ethical dilemmas? This is kind of a universal construct, is to try to determine what the issues are, who's affected, what can be your possible actions, and what will be the consequences of those actions. That's the framework for looking at ethical dilemmas. And again, if we look on what's happening on the internet, what's happening with e-commerce, it's skewed the rules. So we have a number of ways we can look at ethics. And again, not to read these to you guys, the golden rule is one of those common and universal that we do unto others as we wish was done unto us. Universalism, what is good for everyone, or utilitarianism, what's good for most people. So we've got all these different ways to look at ethics, and we're talking about companies, we're talking about corporations dealing with large amounts of people and large amounts of impact. Again, the ways in which we approach ethics sometimes varies. Sometimes we got to look at what's good for the most amount of people, especially when we think about things like privacy. If we limit the amount of information Google has about us and we do things like the right to forget, are we inconveniencing? Are we making life difficult for other people? What about Apple? If Apple has someone who's committed a crime with one of their devices and Apple sells security and encryption on their phones as a feature, do we break that to serve one person, or do we try to serve all the people by maintaining security? These are really tough issues to grapple with. We talk about privacy and information rights. I know we talked about things like privacy and confidentiality in our chapter on security, but privacy basically means that you have the right to be left alone. You have the right to be your own person, free of being invaded. And then we have 4 premises. The first is the right to be forgotten again, and that's something that Google has had to really contend with in Europe, meaning that I can control what you as a company are collecting about me. Yes, you spell it out in the terms and conditions of use, but most people don't read them. What about the right for consent, informed consent, to know when people are collecting information about us? In the United States, we are in what we refer to as an opt-out culture. And that means many companies are gathering information without our consent by default, by using the service you're giving consent. What about due process? Do you have a right to know how your information is being handled? And what about the idea of knowing if your information is being handled securely? Companies should have disclosures about all these things. And the question is, how much do we really know on a lot of these behalfs? The Federal Trade Commission, for example, has a number of practice principles. And they basically are saying that we should be required to give notice. Well, any of these things, sometimes you can meet the letter of the law and still not really be living up to expectations. Let me give you an example. We say a notice of how somebody collects your information in the same way when we go to a website and it says basically that we're collecting information about you on cookies, and using the site you have acknowledged that you agree to our terms of use. Does that fit with the FTC's definition? Yeah, probably. In terms of choice, the idea that there are not monopolies, that there is participation, that people are able to review how their information is being used. We have a reason to expect security, for example, that encryption will be used, that our information will be handled well, and enforcement. If somebody breaks the rules or breaks the site, that a company will come back and try to recover the data to fix the problem. Here's the thing. These are practice principles. This is not law. This is not a universal law. We get into the private sector. We have this balancing act between all these amendments, for example. I'm not going to do a civics class or review with you, but I will point out that a lot of people have the wrong idea about the First Amendment. In the same way, the free speech does not extend to yelling fire in a crowded theater. Free speech is not what we think it is. Free speech is intended to protect matters of public discourse. And we get into things like free speech and privacy. For example, if you are on a privately owned social network, you have agreed to the terms and conditions of use. Are you breaking any kind of law if you are Facebook or your Twitter and you're using customer information how you see fit? Well, that's a good question, because people have likely given up those rights whenever they signed the when they clicked accept on their user agreements. And so, do we really have a user's bill of rights on the internet? No, we don't. And a lot of the things that we talked about in terms of implicit privacy, for example, things that were protected in the Constitution, don't always apply on the internet. And so we get into other things too. The acts like the 1974 Privacy Act were fine for their time, but did not anticipate that we get beyond telecommunications and get into the online world. Again, all of this stuff originally was intended to prevent government from playing too big of a role in your lives. It really didn't have a lot to do. This is kind of a defining point. A lot of this legislation was more geared toward government and not geared toward private companies. So again, the First Amendment applies to the government mainly in discussion of the public concern. It did not anticipate private corporations having this much power in a communication sense. And then we get into the private sector, and what it really comes down to is it's really tough sometimes to know where the line is. There's no law technically that somebody is breaking by gathering information about you if you've agreed to the terms and services of terms and conditions of use. And yeah, are these rules complicated? Yeah, they are complicated. And sometimes it is tough to tell what we've signed, but technically we're talking about letter of the law stuff. And so we've not had a lot of successes in terms of people challenging corporations for the use of their information, particularly if they were given the ability to review things like terms and conditions of use and chose not to. Again, we've got a lot of what we refer to as PII that's going around these days, personally identifiable information. And that means, for example, are there things that are collected about you that could reveal who you are? Any of this stuff could come back to haunt us. Some is more dangerous than others. Things like social security numbers, for example, are pretty darn dangerous. Other things like things about your personal status, your marital status, any of this stuff. And then we get into things like clickstream behavior, and that's really where the money is. Who are you? Where do you like to go online? How can we use that to make money? That's what we're talking about here. In terms of some of the key issues we're talking about, is what you're sharing online really under your control? Or is that information ending up in the hands of other people? Marketers, for example. What about your phone? You know, again, I mentioned this in an earlier chapter. I think that we can get a pretty good indication of what somebody's all about if we look at the types of things they do on their phone. Our phones travel with us everywhere. And we think about things like Siri, for example, and digital assistants. What kind of information are they gathering about us? As we talked about in the chapter on security, companies have already paid class action lawsuits because of the information that smart TVs are gathering about us. So yes, as the documentary The Social Network states, if you get something for free, you're the product. And that's why we're getting so much for free, quote unquote. This information is used essentially to build profiles of individuals so that we have essentially an online face that we show to the internet. I can get profiled. If you ever got to visit me at my office in St. Francis, you'd notice I'm surrounded by Batman paraphernalia. I bet if you look at my internet search history, you'll see a lot of that as well. I'm a big fan of the Cape Crusader. Well, my profile might look like a middle-aged Gen Xer comic book fan, which makes me attractive to advertisers who make products that would satisfy that need. And so that's what we're talking about in terms of building online profiles and how what we search for, the clickstream behavior we participate in, ultimately helps advertising networks produce content that's going to be more closely geared to us. From a business's perspective, yes, we're able to create content and products and services that serve people better. From a critic's perspective, the question is, how much is too much in terms of what we know about people? And are we actually giving different levels of customer service to the detriment of customers based on what we know about you? Tonkin, we know, for example, you teach at a small college, and we know that a person with a similar profile to you is a Fortune 500 company CEO who can afford more for the same products. They might charge her more than they charge me. And again, we're talking about how our information is used. When we talk about social networks, again, we talked a lot about big data in previous chapters. Facebook, Instagram, all of these companies aren't just following us when we're on the apps. They're also looking at what kind of behavior we do while we're logged on to Facebook, while we're logged on to Instagram, while we're logged on to Snapchat, and where else we go. it seems like every time you turn around, Facebook is getting nailed for some kind of violation of users' privacy. I'll give you a great example. Years ago, Zuckerberg and the gang rolled out facial recognition for photos posted on Facebook without even informing the users. So they tend to do things and then apologize later rather than asking for permission. Why? Because we are an opt-out culture, not an opt-in culture here in the United States. And again, who's benefiting from this? The folks who are selling advertising benefit from this. A little experiment. If you are a Facebook user, search for a product in another browser tab when you're on your desktop and see how long it takes for the ads on your Facebook stream to match up with what you were searching for online. So in terms of mobile devices, again, none of us are disabling GPS. Most of us are sticking with the defaults when we download new apps. And most of the defaults are that basically, yes, you're agreeing to be tracked. It's not that it's not useful. Getting targeted advertising is useful and beneficial. It definitely can be. How is that? Well, we get products and services that could be beneficial to us. But the downside is, are you really making an active decision in how your information is being used? That's the question. The Supreme Court has actually backed up that a cell phone is also covered under privilege, meaning that you've got to give consent. You have to either give consent or there has to be a search warrant for the police to go through your phone. But I guarantee you, at some point, if you're convicted or accused of a major crime, somebody is going to be going through your phone. What about other things like regulation? Guys, the takeaway from this, in the United States, we do not enjoy a large degree of consumer protection in terms of information on the internet. There is no rule that says a website can't track you. There is no rule that says if you say, I don't want to be tracked, that a company still can't track you on the internet. There's no rule to that. The do not track mechanism, you'll notice even Apple on the app says that we can request that apps not track you. We can request that you're not tracked on the internet. There's still no guarantees, guys. We do not in this country have an Internet User's Bill of Rights. So in terms of what the Federal Trade Commission is looking at here, essentially, they give recommendations. They're basically saying companies should be more transparent. They should tell users what their expectations of privacy are, what they can expect, what they should expect, what is reasonable, but there's no guarantees here. I think that the idea that we're coming down to, the feds are trying to say to companies, trying to say to folks on Wall Street, these types of regulations, this type of documentation should be easier to follow. Bottom line, there's very few rules that actually enforce this. So this is where it also gets really interesting. Back in 2015, broadband ISPs were put under FCC. And that meant, for example, that there had to be regulation of things like content. We got into the whole net neutrality thing. And 2016 and beyond, essentially, a lot of these regulations got rolled back. What does this mean? Okay, under federal communications, under FCC guidelines, you can't bug somebody's phone. You cannot tap somebody's communications. If you're a communications provider, for example, you cannot collect information on telephone calls without the permission of users. You have to tell people if something is being recorded. Those same guidelines do not apply to internet communications. And when the internet was regulated under FCC, when it was viewed as a telecommunications methodology, those rules did apply. When it became deregulated, all of a sudden it didn't. So that's the point of deregulation. It was helpful for companies to be able to gather more information on individuals because they were no longer regulated like voice. And again, by 2016, 2017, we saw more deregulation. Think about that for a second. If I make a phone call on a traditional telephone network, if I'm not on the internet, I enjoy certain protections. The idea that somebody cannot tap my phone, I cannot be recorded without my consent and have it used in a court of law. When you're communicating on the internet, the same rules don't apply because the FCC decided that the internet is not the same kind of communications medium. Think about that for a minute. How much do we do online now versus how many phone calls we make? I would argue we're doing a heck of a lot more online than we are in terms of making phone calls these days. Okay, in terms of privacy policies, every website should have them, but it comes down to the idea that most people don't read them, and even if you do, there's probably conflicts in there as well. What are companies really doing in this regard? As I mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, Europe has stronger regard for privacy. They have an opt-in culture, which means basically you have to choose to be included in an advertising network. You have to choose to allow your information to be shared. In the United States, we can set those by default, and you have to opt out. When your credit card company sends you a notice of how they're using your information, by default, they're going to be maximizing it for their own gain. So you have to make a choice on how you want your information used. And again, people are getting turned off by it, but we have short memories in this country as well. The industry themselves is supposed to be self-regulating, but in reality, the industry's benefiting from using our data. Is the industry really going to limit their collection of data? Is the industry really going to say we want less information on consumers? No. And consumers do benefit from what we know about them. But I don't think it's reasonable to expect we're going to see a lot of moves toward greater privacy if we're counting on the internet to do it. If we're counting on companies that benefit from this current method of data mining to do it. And so again, it doesn't really help. If you got the watchers, who's watching the watchers, as the old expression goes, the folks who benefit from having access to your data aren't going to limit access to it. There's a few, not a few, there's a lot of ways we can protect our privacy online, whether you're using VPNs, things like DuckDuckGo, or using anonymous browsers, encryption. In fact, back in chapter 5, we experimented with encryption. These are all good. But keep in mind, they're still created by the same industry that's using our data. So how much information blocking do we really have? How much expectation of privacy do we really have? If we look at this, for example, we're talking now where our personal information, our preferences, our thoughts, the way we interact is the most valuable commodity that exists. So again, I'm not really optimistic we're going to see a lot of people really giving up access to that information. So what are the limitations? At this point in time, they're voluntary. If you ask somebody not to track you, ask a website not to track you, there is no law. There's no Internet Users Bill of Rights that says that they have to do anything regarding your privacy, because that is voluntary. That's an important point to note. These standards are voluntary. People who are counting on them to keep us safe are not really thinking this through. We're talking about voluntary standards by an industry who said, yeah, if you ask me not to track you, we won't track you. How much faith do you have in that? I don't know that I have a lot. So, and again, some of the other things too. Some of this legislation is really reaching the end of its life cycle, because when we look at acts like CALEA, for example, in Carnivore, these were acts to basically ensure that people could not have encryption, that the government could not break. And we already saw companies like Apple standing up to the government saying, we're not going to give you our encryption, and the government didn't have a way to break private encryption. What we're really seeing here is an arms race between the government and private corporations, who has better security, who has better stuff to be able to protect data. And the bottom line is sometimes the private industry is better than the government is. We go back to the iPhone 6. Again, what this encryption controversy was about, I'll mention this very quickly. There was a mass shooting in the state of California. It's the San Bernardino shooting. 2 individuals went to a holiday party and killed a bunch of their coworkers. And law enforcement was trying to get onto their iPhones to be able to see what had led up to this. They wanted to be able to see if there were clues. And they had encrypted their iPhones. The 2 perpetrators had encrypted their iPhones. The government had asked if Apple would decrypt the phone to be able to allow them to try to search for clues. The response that they got from Apple was, if we decrypt this phone, it'll crack our encryption. All end users will be at stake, and they refused to do it. Ultimately, the government was able to decrypt the data on their own, but Apple stood up to the government and won. And which side of the argument are you on? Well, on one hand, we're talking about utilitarianism. What's best for the greatest number of people? People who value data security would argue that Apple did the right thing. But was it the right thing by not helping find out what caused the mass shooting? That's how powerful this tech is right now. So again, we look at things like contact tracing. regardless of your stance on things like the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccines, and the like, the bigger question is, we can very quickly share information over cell phone networks that can do a lot with things like public health, but at what cost? So what amount of our personal liberty are we willing to give up to be able to help stop the spread of a pandemic, for example? That's a decision I can't make for you, obviously, and I wouldn't try to. But this is why the technology is no longer just an extension of us. It's changing our behavior as well. Then we get into the idea of intellectual property. And again, you can read the issues for yourselves. The biggest takeaway here ultimately is that because so much of what we're dealing with intellectual property-wise is in intangibles. We're not talking about fabricating copies of physical devices. We're talking about code at this point in time. And that's what's valuable. For example, Amazon, back in, I guess it was 1997, patented one-click purchasing, and until 2017 had a lock on it. And so we're getting into a situation these days where it's harder and harder to know where property begins and ends. So the main types of copyright protection, again, you've got copyright and patent. Copyright tends to be things like intellectual property of created types of works. For example, if you write a book or if you write a song, a patent means you've come up with a unique device or a unique design. Trademarks, things, for example, like the Nike swoosh. And the trade secrets law, meaning you have a unique formula, for example. It's a balancing act to try to have competition, but to protect intellectual property. Why is this getting tougher in the e-commerce era? Here's why. Well, if I've got Nike's design and a 3D printer, and I'm talking about shoes that are made out of synthetic materials, technically I can make some of the best bootlegs you've ever seen. And so we're seeing now that it's tougher and tougher to know where the lines are between physical property and intangible property, and how do you protect those kinds of intellectual rights. Again, copyright has been under attack since the internet came around and people discovered MP3s for making perfect digital copies of music. And yes, it's illegal to share copyrighted material, but the internet makes it really easy. This is really tough to enforce at this point in time. Patents, same idea. Information is traveling so quickly, and if you're talking about global trade, sometimes it's really hard to control how somebody in another country is using a patent or a device you came up with. Again, the information's moving over the internet. So the e-commerce patents we talk about here, I always love to talk about Amazon's one-click purchasing. Why is that so neat to me? Because it was 1997, and the very fact that for a period of time, if you wanted to make a one-click purchase on a website, you had to pay a royalty to Amazon is crazy to me. That's how little people knew about the internet in the early days. Trademarks, again, have a lot of value. Just ask anybody from Nike who's trying to weed out counterfeit sneakers that are coming with perfect swooshes on them from parts of China. And again, we get into other things. For example, trademarks and the internet are a touchy thing. For example, we get into the idea of cyber squatting. Years ago, if you went to whitehouse.com, you would hope that you hadn't seen what you had just seen. It was a pornography site for a long time because somebody was cyber squatting, trying to get somebody else to pay up big for the domain name. Typo squatting, if you spell something wrong, like instead of Barnes and Noble, you might write Barnes and Nibble, it might take you to another website you don't want to go to. Again, we have people also trying to hijack other people's keywords by saying, for example, Nike and taking you to an Adidas site. So these trademarks and names can be hijacked too. They can be very difficult to make sure, even on a Google search, that people are going to the correct website. And again, trade secrets, again, we're talking about novel combinations. Secrets, for example, Big Mac's secret sauce from McDonald's. The recipe has probably been leaked millions of times online. It's very difficult to protect that stuff. Who ultimately is controlling our governance? Again, this is an international peer-to-peer network, essentially, the internet. Who's controlling intellectual property? It's anybody's guess. ICANN's a good place to start because they control the DNS. The bottom line, it's really difficult to enforce things like trade secrets and copyright law on the internet. We're going to be talking about AI on our assignment this week, but this has changed the game. It's hard to put into words what kind of impact it's going to have. Why? Because we're talking now about non-human types of intellect, for lack of a better term, who are going to be creating content on our behalves. At this point, who owns the intellectual property? Even the lawyers don't know the answer to this one yet. Is this unique composition? Can we take credit for it if we created it using ChatGPT or asked ChatGPT to create it for us? And we're also going to see now the evolution of things like contextual searching, because we're not just going to be searching for keywords anymore. We're going to be searching for abstract concepts. I'm not going to be asking about bed and breakfasts in Dublin, Ireland. I'm going to be now asking an AI-enabled chatbot to help me plan my vacation from Ireland so that my wife loves it. And again, the global nature of the internet is also making it difficult for things like taxes. Companies like Amazon have avoided paying taxes for years because they kept moving their distribution sites around. And again, companies are now charging sales tax, but it's something that gets pushed back again and again. Do you charge the tax in the individual state where the customer lives or where the corporation is located? We get into net neutrality. It's something that has since expired, and the idea was, this is a complex issue, but the idea was that ISPs under net neutrality laws should not be able to prioritize traffic to specific websites or services. Here's the best example I can think of. Under net neutrality rules, if I've got Atlantic Broadband, who also provides a video streaming service, and I subscribe to Netflix, if Atlantic Broadband owns the network without net neutrality, they can prioritize that their streaming service for video will be faster than Netflix will be. So they can choose what goes over their networks. Net neutrality basically said the internet is a utility and should be regulated as such. Nobody should get more water than anybody else, using water as an analogy for bandwidth. When net neutrality laws expired under the previous presidential administration, essentially corporations were saying we should be able to invest in our own private networks for the betterment of our customers. In reality, it's a very good move for people who own the cable networks, not such a good move maybe for small businesses. Again, complex issue, more complex than we can deal with in a single slide on a presentation. Balancing the freedom of information with the safety of vulnerable populations has been challenging, to say the least. The best example I can think of, in the late 90s, America Online was trying to weed out pornography off their networks. A group of breast cancer survivors were not happy, however, because the word breast was classified as pornography, and these individuals who were a survivors group could no longer meet. How do you balance the idea of keeping illicit materials away from children while also enabling people to have fair information access? Not an easy challenge to be able to answer. And finally, if we want to know where the birth of crypto came from, it all goes back to the idea that people using sites like Pirate Bay now are buying drugs and other illicit materials online using crypto because you can't seize those assets like you can cash. This is a complicated issue. Folks, this is a very oversimplified look at the impact of technology and the internet on society and vice versa. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion. I look forward to working with you.